At first glance, Sophie and Mark Williams seemed to live the kind of life many people envied. They were in their early 30s, both successful in their careers and respected in their community. They had 2 children, Emily, 8, and Noah, 6, who were the center of their world. They lived in a spacious house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a white picket fence, a well-manicured lawn, and a couple of friendly neighbors. To the outside world, they appeared to be the epitome of a happy family, and it seemed as though nothing could disrupt the picture-perfect life they had built. Sophie worked as a marketing manager for a well-known company, a position she had worked hard for. Mark, on the other hand, was a successful real estate agent with a reputation for closing deals and charming his clients. His charismatic nature made him well-liked among friends and acquaintances, and his smooth-talking ways earned him a great deal of respect in their social circles. People often spoke highly of the couple, and many admired their family's seemingly unshakable bond. They attended school functions, social gatherings, and family barbecues together, always looking happy and engaged. It was the kind of life most people only dreamed of. However, as the years passed, Sophie began to sense subtle changes in her marriage. At first, she didn't think much of it. Mark's long hours at the office, the late-night phone calls, and the occasional weekend away were all things that she convinced herself were simply part of his busy career. Yet, as time went on, Sophie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. She tried to push the thoughts to the back of her mind, reminding herself that Mark was just working hard to provide for their family. Still, the changes in his behavior were becoming harder to ignore. Mark's once affectionate demeanor seemed to vanish, replaced with coldness and distance. He no longer showed the same interest in their family activities or in spending quality time with Sophie. His attention seemed to be elsewhere, and his conversations often felt forced. Sophie noticed that he was becoming more secretive, locking his phone whenever she was around and refusing to share details about his day. Whenever she asked questions, he would brush her off with vague responses or change the subject. His absence at home grew more frequent, and Sophie began to wonder if it had something to do with his work. But even then, something didn't sit right. It wasn't just his lack of presence that bothered her. Mark had always been charming and kind, yet lately he seemed on edge. His temper, once mild and easygoing, became unpredictable. Sophie found herself walking on eggshells around him, afraid to bring up certain topics for fear of triggering an argument. The warmth between them seemed to evaporate, replaced by an unsettling tension. He was always too busy for her, but when he did make time for her, it felt strained and awkward. He would make promises to spend more time together, but these plans often fell through at the last minute, and Sophie began to feel like she was no longer a priority in his life. The turning point came one evening when Sophie came across something that would change everything. She was in their bedroom, tidying up, when she found Mark's phone lying face down on the nightstand. It was unusual for him to leave it unattended. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the best of her. She picked it up and saw a message notification pop up on the screen. It was from someone named Sarah, a name she didn't recognize. The message simply read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The feeling of dread she had been suppressing for so long began to surge through her. She told herself it was just a coincidence, maybe a colleague or a friend. But the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She carefully placed the phone back on the nightstand and left the room, trying to act normal, but in the back of her mind the question lingered. Who was Sarah? For days after finding the message, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The name Sarah echoed in her mind constantly, each time more unsettling than the last. She tried to dismiss it as a simple misunderstanding. Mark had plenty of colleagues and friends. Perhaps this Sarah was just someone he worked with, someone she didn't know well. But the more she tried to reason with herself, the more the doubt grew. It wasn't just the message, it was everything. The late nights, the sudden changes in Mark's behavior, the distance between them. All of it was adding up to something she could no longer ignore. Sophie spent the next few days in a haze of anxiety. She watched Mark closely, scrutinizing his every move, trying to see if there were any signs that could confirm her worst fears. His behavior became more erratic. He would leave for work earlier and come home later, always with some excuse for his absences. He seemed distracted and distant, his mind elsewhere. Sophie caught him more than once glancing at his phone when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and each time the suspicion that he was hiding something deepened. The sense of dread Sophie felt grew every day, gnawing at her insides like a constant ache. She had to know for sure. She couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. After days of second-guessing herself, Sophie decided to confront Mark. But she knew this would be no simple conversation. Her heart raced as she rehearsed what she would say, unsure of how he would react, but certain that she couldn't keep living in the dark. The confrontation took place late one evening. Mark had just come home after a long day at work, looking exhausted but still carrying that air of detachment Sophie had come to dread. They sat down in the living room and Sophie took a deep breath before she spoke. She asked him about the message from Sarah. The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. She watched his reaction closely, waiting for some sign of guilt, some flicker of truth, but he didn't flinch. At first, Mark seemed genuinely confused. He denied knowing anyone named Sarah, brushing it off as a mistake. Sophie's heart sank as he continued to lie, his face a mask of disbelief. He assured her it was all just a mix-up, that it was someone from work sending an innocent message. But Sophie wasn't convinced. The doubt that had been festering inside her now bloomed into full-fledged suspicion. She could see the guilt in his eyes, even if he tried to hide it. As the conversation continued, Mark became more defensive, his tone sharper. He grew frustrated with her questioning, snapping at her in a way that wasn't typical. Sophie's anxiety turned into anger as she realized how easily he was dismissing her concerns. She had caught him in a lie, but he was determined to brush it off as nothing. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the tension building between them like an electric charge. But there was something else, too, something that chilled her to the bone. Mark was hiding something, and it wasn't just about Sarah. His behavior, his anger, the way he was shutting her out, it all pointed to something more sinister. Sophie could sense it now more than ever. She wasn't just dealing with an affair. There was a deeper, darker truth lying just beneath the surface, and she was terrified of what it might be. In the days that followed, Sophie's world began to unravel. She could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. She was living in a house with a man who was no longer the person she thought she knew. The warmth, the love, the trust, they had all disappeared, replaced with lies, secrets, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She was no longer just dealing with her husband's infidelity. She was facing the possibility that the man she had built her life with had become someone she didn't recognize. The fear of what she might uncover next kept her awake at night. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's lies were just the tip of the iceberg. As much as she wanted to believe he was simply caught up in an affair, deep down she feared there was something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. His increasingly erratic behavior, his unexplained absences, and his defensiveness were all signs of something she wasn't ready to confront. Sophie was no longer just heartbroken and betrayed, she was terrified. The private investigator she hired confirmed her suspicions. It didn't take long for the investigator to gather the necessary evidence. Sophie wasn't just dealing with a cheating husband. Mark was having an affair with Sarah, and it was more serious than she could have ever imagined. The investigator was able to track Mark's movements over the past few months, pinpointing exactly when he would meet Sarah and where. But the investigator uncovered something even more chilling. A pattern of late-night phone calls, secret meetings, and, most disturbingly, discussions about how Mark planned to start fresh with Sarah, leaving his family behind. Sophie was stunned. She had always known Mark to be ambitious, but she never suspected he could be capable of something so cold and calculating. The affair itself was painful enough, but now, she realized, it was only a small part of a much darker plan. Sophie wasn't just the wronged wife. She was a pawn in Mark's game of escape. He had a plan, and Sophie was the obstacle. The more Sophie thought about it, the more the pieces of Mark's behavior began to fall into place. The late nights, the sudden trips, the way he'd been pushing her away. These were all signs that he was preparing for something. But what terrified her most was the growing realization that Sophie herself was part of his plan. Mark didn't just want to leave her, he wanted her gone. For good. Sophie thought back to the time she found the note in his jacket pocket, the one with the chilling lines written in his own handwriting. "I need to get rid of her. She's holding me back. If I can make it look like an accident, it'll be perfect." Those words haunted her every waking moment. How long had Mark been planning this? How long had he been plotting her death, and she had no idea? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her body. She had been living under the same roof as a man who was actively trying to find a way to kill her and make it look like a tragic accident. Sophie's mind raced. Was he going to stage a car crash, a fall down the stairs? Or maybe he'd make it look like she drowned during a family outing. Sophie couldn't know for sure, but she could sense it. Mark was getting closer to carrying out his plan. His behavior was becoming more erratic. His guilt was starting to slip through the cracks, and Sophie could see the darkness in his eyes now. He wasn't the man she had married, but a stranger who had no hesitation about ending her life for the sake of his new future with Sarah. Sophie was caught in a terrifying web of deceit, but she wasn't going to let herself become a victim. She had to act, and she had to do it quickly. With her heart pounding, she began taking steps to protect herself. She started documenting everything: messages, notes, recordings of suspicious conversations, anything that could be used as evidence. Sophie even made a trip to a local police station, speaking with a detective about her growing concerns. She didn't know how or when Mark would make his move, but she wasn't going to sit back and wait for the inevitable. The more she uncovered, the more Sophie realized how deep the deception went. Mark had been planning her murder, and Sophie had just discovered the beginning of a nightmare that she couldn't afford to ignore. She was no longer just the wife of a cheating husband. She was the target of a man who had turned his love into something twisted and deadly. As the days dragged on, Sophie's fear intensified, but so did her resolve. She knew that if she didn't act fast, she could become the next victim of Mark's sinister plan. His behavior had become even more erratic. He was colder, more distant, and there were moments when Sophie would catch him staring at her, his gaze unnervingly cold, as if he were already thinking about how to get rid of her. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point, and every day felt like she was walking on a razor's edge, unsure of what Mark might do next. Sophie's first step was to gather evidence. She had begun documenting everything: the late-night phone calls, the strange absences, the notes she had found. She installed security cameras around the house, ones that would capture every movement, every word. She set up a hidden recorder to capture conversations when Mark didn't realize she was nearby. Sophie's every move was calculated, her actions quiet but determined. She had to be careful. She couldn't let Mark suspect that she was onto him. She made sure to keep up the facade of a normal marriage, even though every interaction with Mark felt like an act. They still shared meals together, still appeared like a family when Emily and Noah were around, but Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of the lie that hung between them. Her heart was constantly racing. She was living in a house that was no longer a home, but a ticking time bomb. Sophie's next move was to reach out to a lawyer. She couldn't risk waiting for Mark to make his move. The lawyer listened intently to her concerns, offering advice on what she could do to protect herself legally. Sophie explained her suspicions about Mark's intentions and the evidence she had gathered. The lawyer suggested that she take steps to secure her children's safety and prepare for the worst, whether that meant an eventual divorce or something far more dangerous. The lawyer recommended filing a restraining order, but Sophie hesitated. She couldn't act too soon, not without more evidence. If she made her suspicions known to Mark, he might change his tactics or become even more dangerous. But Sophie wasn't blind to the risk. Each day she became more aware of how much danger she was in. Mark had become increasingly unpredictable. He was no longer just the man she once loved. He was a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable harm. His temper was growing shorter, his words sharper. Sophie couldn't help but wonder if the changes in his behavior were signs that he was finally preparing to make his move. The tension in the house was unbearable, and the fear that something terrible might happen at any moment consumed her thoughts. She began making small, subtle moves to protect herself. Sophie confided in a trusted friend, someone she had known for years but never thought would be a part of her plan. She instructed the friend to keep a close eye on her children just in case. Sophie also started taking different routes when she drove the kids to school, just to make sure that Mark wasn't following her, watching her every move. Despite the overwhelming anxiety that threatened to paralyze her, Sophie knew she couldn't afford to be consumed by fear. She had to stay one step ahead of Mark, even if it meant putting her own safety at risk in the process. The small victories, installing cameras, collecting evidence, making sure her children were safe, gave her a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she wasn't helpless. She was still in control, even if only for a moment. But it was the day Mark's behavior took a turn for the worse that Sophie truly understood the danger she was in. That afternoon he came home late, like always. Sophie had noticed how he seemed more agitated than usual, his movements jerky, his eyes darting around the room. He didn't even acknowledge her presence, going straight for the liquor cabinet. When he turned toward her, there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. He seemed different, more unhinged. He was no longer just angry or cold. He was dangerous. Sophie's stomach twisted with the realization that she had been living in a house with a man who was capable of far worse than betrayal. This was no longer about an affair. Mark had become a threat, and the plans he had for her were even darker than she had feared. The knot in Sophie's stomach tightened. She had one choice. She had to get out, and she had to do it soon. The night Sophie had been dreading finally arrived, but it wasn't the disaster she feared. It was something she never could have predicted. Mark had become increasingly hostile in the days leading up to that night, and Sophie had no illusions about what was coming. She knew he was getting closer to putting his plan into action, and she couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had to act, but she had to do so with precision, without giving him a chance to suspect she was onto him. Sophie had planned everything down to the smallest detail. After consulting with her lawyer and carefully laying out her strategy, she knew that the best chance she had was to let Mark make the first move. The evidence she had gathered, from the secret recordings to the photos and the incriminating note, would ensure that she had the upper hand. But she needed to make sure Mark believed he was still in control. She had to let him think his plan was unfolding perfectly. That evening, as Mark arrived home, he seemed particularly on edge. He barely acknowledged Sophie, too focused on something, perhaps the next step in his scheme. Sophie did her best to act normal, though her heart raced in her chest. She didn't let him see the fear in her eyes, but she knew that every minute was precious. She quietly prepared herself for the worst, but she wasn't going to be a passive victim. She had already made her move behind the scenes, and now it was time to put everything into place. Mark had been drinking, his words were slurred, and he began to rant about Sophie's paranoia and how she was ruining everything. He told her that if she didn't get out of his way, she'd regret it. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about his intentions, and Sophie knew that he had finally slipped. His mask was starting to crack. Mark's fury rose, his anger and frustration boiling over, but Sophie remained calm. Almost eerily so. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue back. She simply let him vent. All the while, her mind was working quickly, calculating the next step. Just as he was about to storm out, Sophie made her move. She reached for her phone and sent a pre-scheduled message to the police, an emergency alert with the address and all the relevant details of Mark's previous behavior. She had been careful in the days leading up to this. She had spoken to the police officer on her contact list, detailing Mark's threats, the evidence she had, and her fears. They had advised her to wait for the right moment, and this was it. The timing was perfect. Mark was just about to leave when the sirens blared outside. He froze, his eyes narrowing in confusion. Sophie's heart pounded as she saw the police car pull up to their driveway. For a brief moment, Mark seemed stunned, as if the reality of his actions had finally caught up with him. But that moment of confusion quickly turned into panic. As the officers stepped out of the car, Mark's face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mix of fury and fear. He turned towards Sophie, his expression shifting from disbelief to rage. He tried to run, to escape the consequences of his actions, but the police were already on him. The officers were quick, and within minutes they had him restrained, reading him his rights. Sophie stood there, her body trembling, not from fear but from relief. Mark's twisted plan had unraveled before he could even put it into motion. In the days that followed, Sophie's life began to shift, but not in the way she expected. The trial was intense, the courtroom filled with the undeniable evidence of Mark's betrayal and his plan to murder her. Sophie's lawyer presented the evidence, messages, recordings, and the handwritten note, painting a picture of a man who had been planning her death for months. It was a bitter, painful reality to face. But Sophie stood firm, knowing that she had survived. The man who once promised to love and cherish her had plotted her destruction, and she had outsmarted him at every turn. Mark was convicted of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, a harsh but necessary punishment for the woman he nearly killed in his pursuit of a new life. Sarah, his mistress, was also arrested for her role in the scheme, though her involvement was far less direct. The authorities made it clear that without Sophie's quick thinking and determination, the outcome could have been very different. Sophie's life was never the same after that night, but she began to heal. She moved away from the house where the betrayal took place, taking Emily and Noah to a new home where they could start fresh. It wasn't easy. Nothing could erase the scars left by her near-death experience and the man she had once loved. But Sophie learned to trust herself again. She rediscovered her strength, her resilience, and her ability to move forward, no matter how dark the path had once seemed.